Tonight, we're delighted to have Freddie New here as our guest on the show. Freddie is the Chief Policy Officer and co-founder at Bitcoin Policy UK. He has extensive experience and background in private equity and law, holding various advisory and consultancy roles across multiple sectors. Freddie, really happy to have you here. How are you? How are you keeping? And how have things been over the last few months? You've been a busy man.
Well, firstly to say, you made me sound much more impressive than I realised I was. But thank you very much for that great intro, and, Alan, Chris, lovely to be on the show with you. Appreciate you reaching out and inviting me. I feel very privileged to be a part of early days of Emerge21. But you're right, busy few months for us as well as you, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as Chris was saying beforehand, we've 3-4 months now we've been going now, Chris, with Emerge21. So it's a new venture for us. And Chris, as he says, you were the first guest we reached out to. So it's great to have you on board here and just hear about your background, your story, what you're doing, what you've been doing over the last 6 to 8 months. Effectively, I bet you've been speaking at quite a few conferences as well, haven't you? You've been traveling about quite a bit and doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you're completely right. So last 2 years have been busy. So maybe if you want a sort of bit of a journey in. So I think in some ways my Bitcoin journey is a bit of a cautionary tale. And if there's one takeaway message, it's take Bitcoin seriously earlier rather than later. I think I started reading about Bitcoin in not long after the financial crisis, 2012, 2013. Oh, yeah. When I first really became aware of it was like maybe 2013, the Cypriot banking crisis. I remember writing a paper at the law firm I was at the time about the bail-in. So if some of your listeners aren't aware, during the Cypriot banking crisis in 2013, everyone whose deposits were above a certain level had those monies effectively confiscated by the government and used to bail out the Cypriot banks. And that was a real world illustration of how important it is to have a money that can't be arbitrarily confiscated. And so there are a few articles about Bitcoin in the press at the time. And that was when I first became aware of it and first began reading stories about it. Because I'm an idiot, I didn't buy any Bitcoin in 2013. So that's the cautionary tale bit. So, if I could go back, I would say, forget about reading about the Cypriot banking crisis. Just pump all of your spare cash into Bitcoin, and then I'd be doing this call from a tropical island somewhere rather than from my front room. But you live and learn. And then over time, I think probably the next gateway in was actually through building computers. So I used to game a lot. Again, before I had kids. And I remember 2015, I just built a new water-cooled gaming computer, and I thought, I'm going to try mining Bitcoin. I still didn't understand it properly, didn't know what was going on. I was also too late. 2014, ASICs came out, and so even my massive graphics card on my computer was completely incapable of competing with ASICs. So I think I never did the maths, but I think I'd lost a reasonable amount of money in terms of electricity costs. But it was a fun experience. And then I, stayed interested in Bitcoin for after that. And then you guys are probably similar in your friendship groups. You kind of become the Bitcoin guy whenever there's a price spike, and people laugh at you and say, "Oh, how's your Bitcoin going?" And then it crashes, and then they laugh at you. And that obviously went on through 17 and 18. And then eventually I segued out of private practice law and moving into fintech startups. And working at a fintech startup in London, I was instrumental in building and shipping the cryptocurrency and Bitcoin product that they were looking to offer. And it was as part of that I began doing a lot more consultation responses, work with the FCA, with Parliament, submitting documentation to Treasury and so on. And it became clear that not many people were doing that only about Bitcoin. So really that kind of illustrated a need for a group that was focused on Bitcoin rather than the whole of markets, just on this one specific asset. And then I don't know if either of you made it to the Edinburgh conference in October 2022.
Yeah, I was there. Yeah,
you were there. Oh, we could have bumped into each other.
I know. Yeah, I didn't know anybody. I was just.
Neither did I.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was really good. Yeah, really,
I loved that one. It was
yeah.
really, really nice conference. Jordan and Jim Duffy did a fantastic job there.
Hmm.
And it was after that that I reached out to Jordan and some of the team, and he began to put together a few round tables of people who had not dissimilar backgrounds. And there were enough of us to put together our Bitcoin policy group, which we launched as a not-for-profit in April. God, it's 2 years ago now. 2023. And the goal of that was really to advocate for good policy in the UK, which of course includes Northern Ireland. So coincidentally.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it is. I think that's the tricky part is trying to inform or get information across. I guess you're finding with the government and dealing with government departments, is there lots of barriers there? Is there barriers to entry to talk around Bitcoin specifically? Because I know there was a lady at the Bitcoin conference in Scotland from the government, wasn't it, the UK government?
Lisa Cameron.
Yeah, Lisa Cameron. I couldn't remember her name.
Mm.
So it was interesting just at that time listening, and it appeared to me that there was just a general lack of understanding around the crypto space. They just grouped Bitcoin in with crypto. And it was as if, there was a lot of information being imparted on stage where she was actually picking up different things that she didn't really know about Bitcoin specifically. And do you find that's still the case when you're talking with people and dealing with government departments potentially around finance within the Bitcoin kind of policy making industry within that area? Do you find it difficult to communicate in that respect, I guess?
Frankly, and one would answer yes.
Mm.
And I think we're dealing with really two barriers there. So firstly, there's the barrier where none of these people seem to understand that it is a real thing, a real industry, a real asset. There's an enormous resistance to being able to understand that Bitcoin is real, it's not going away, it has certain properties, and the properties are X, Y, Z. This is how the asset behaves. So it's very, very hard, I think, for the type of people who become politicians to understand the concepts like digital scarcity or concepts like proof of work and how important that is, or even something as simple as a protocol. It's interesting you mentioned Lisa Cameron. So I've been to a couple of events in Parliament in the UK, where talking in a round table with Lisa Cameron in the House of Commons, and I drew a comparison between TCP/IP and the Bitcoin protocol. How this is in the same way that TCP/IP underlies the internet. The Bitcoin protocol is like a base layer of internet money. And I said to her in the round table, you use the internet every day, but you probably never think about TCP/IP. And she said, well, actually, I don't think about it because I've never heard of it before.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where you eventually want to get with Bitcoin. But at the moment, we're in a transitional phase, so it's useful for people to have heard about it. And then I think the second barrier is once they acknowledge that Bitcoin is real, then there's an enormous amount of money and lobbying in crypto shitcoinery. And as soon as politicians show a smidgen of interest in the subject, they get absolutely hammered from all angles by shitcoiners. I won't name any names. We can perhaps name them as we go on, and I become slightly more tipsy from the whiskey. But
It's okay.
yeah.
But
That's what we're missing, Chris. We should have got.
yeah, maybe we should record our shows now with whiskey.
Oh, you're not. It's surely a rule of thumb. You've got to have a.
Is that the way to do?
Yeah, okay.
That's the key takeaway from tonight. There we go.
Yeah. Freddie, I know obviously two major barriers. Well, one seems like an education piece, and it's not. As you say, the background the politicians come through, they're not receptive of a lot of new technologies like this and a new monetary system altogether. I'm probably going deep with this question already, but a lot of people and Bitcoiners say whatever country you're in, people should vote with their feet. Go where you're treated best, and I think there's a couple of aspects in the UK they're not looking overly friendly at the moment towards Bitcoin, and sometimes even its citizens. I think taxes, not the tax laws here are not favorable to certain groups of people, and the Bitcoin policies aren't favorable as well. So like there's always that kind of mentality of, vote with your feet, go where you're best treated. What you're doing is probably the opposite of that. You're fighting, for the UK. What would you kind of say to someone who's thinking, look, if the UK doesn't change this around in the next few months, I've got, say, a talented Bitcoiner with a bit of money can move elsewhere. Like, would you say that you can see maybe a turn in the corner for the UK and see a difference soon? Is it worth fighting for it, or is it destined to continue to fade over many years? I've heard actually Peter McCormack talk about this. Like, unless there's major change in the political sphere, then it's only going one direction. And sometimes a lot of Bitcoiners aren't even interested in voting right now, because you're like, it's seen as voting for two sides of the same coin, really. So yeah, what's your kind of take on that? Like, obviously you're fighting, you're doing something now at the moment that's definitely helping the cause. What would you say to Bitcoiners who are thinking, I'm going to get out of here soon?
Quite a few things to think about there. I think obviously if you decide that going somewhere else is best for your family, for yourself, and for your business, then fair enough. And certainly economically speaking, that's inarguably true. If you were setting up a Bitcoin business for the moment, for example, I don't think you would look at the UK and think it's the best jurisdiction for you to do that. So if you were, for example, just reading off a few names, Relay, River, they can't operate in the UK because the cost of compliance with our regulation is so high. So if you're looking to set up a business like Relay or River, then you might look at the UK and think, it's not worth the compliance cost, hiring these lawyers, waiting for 2 years before I could launch my product. Or I could go and, ironically, we're in a situation at the moment where the EU is a friendlier jurisdiction from a regulatory point of view than the UK, which I personally feel ashamed about. But I think the flip side is, I have a great fondness for the UK. I grew up overseas. I grew up in the Middle East and in Southern Africa, but my ancestors were from the UK, and before my family left the country, I was actually born in London as well, and I have a great fondness for the UK. I came here, as a young man, and it's been good to me, and I have a great fondness for the country and its history and its culture, and I'd like to change that in a positive way if I can. And the worry I have, if all the entrepreneurs and all the people who want to change things for the better leave, then what does that say for everyone else who's left behind who can't leave? Those of us who can leave are in a privileged position. And I'm far from, I'm much more libertarian than anything else in my political views, but I very strongly believe that if you can help other people, you've got a duty to do what you can, as in as far as that's reasonable for you to do that. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to have a significant effect in the end, but while I can, I've always said I've got at least one cycle in me of trying to do this. So I'll try for a cycle, and then I may need to pass it on to someone else. But I think a lot of us in Bitcoin Policy UK felt that we had a reasonably good understanding of the subject matter, and we wanted to try and course correct it and make a difference in the UK where no one else had previously tried to do that.
Yeah, and I watched a couple of your interviews and been following you for a while. Do you think maybe in the last 12 months with goings on in the US and things and the progress that's happening there and maybe in other countries as well, the UK are starting to take notice more of this? Like, do you see any kind of change since you kind of started this journey?
I'd say yes. The UK is such a strange place in terms of the way that we think about these things. We've already mentioned the lack of understanding from politicians around technical issues like internet protocols, and you've probably read the Croesus article, why the yuppie elite dismissed Bitcoin. That describes the UK establishment down to a T. And everyone in the civil service and in politics is really in the quadrant of people who have high intelligence and high trust in the system, so arguably the least likely to understand Bitcoin. But I think, as you've rightly pointed out, changes in the US are almost market-driven forces. There's an element of realpolitik going on here, which is that even if people in politics and the civil service don't understand Bitcoin and don't like it, at some point, it becomes the weight of evidence becomes completely imponderable, and the fact that the US ETFs have been the most successful ETF launches in history, the fact that you now have sovereign nations looking at Bitcoin reserves, even if they don't approve them, the fact that they've opened the Overton window and those are now subjects that it's okay to discuss in those kind of circles, the implications of that I don't think have been fully understood. That's taken. I mean, the FCA has frankly been caught with their pants down. Their attitude towards Bitcoin has always been, this is a weird little thing that strange internet people do, and it will eventually go away if we just ignore it hard enough. That argument is completely dead. They don't quite realize that yet, but it's inarguably true. And you're completely right. I think the changes in the US are inevitably going to drive changes over here, albeit a lot more slowly than we would like.
Well, that's it, because the market dynamics will basically it'll force government and governmental departments to take note and to really spend time on it. But again, when you think about it, they're going to have a steep learning curve to catch up. And historically, like, you're going to be talking probably at least 5 years lag behind the US potentially. But it's just a strange, I'm a small business owner as well. And, I'm seeing it. I talk to other business owners. And you can tell, like, businesses are struggling, and, especially coming now into March, April onwards, I reckon there's going to be a lot more, more problems for small businesses with staff layoffs, the national insurance increases, and staff minimum wages going up and things like that. But you would think, like, from a logical standpoint, and as you say, with like thinking about internet protocols, Bitcoin is a protocol for money. You would think there'd be people within governmental departments, paying attention and having some kind of awareness around that, or is it literally just they're so closed off to their centralized system and they're comfortable and, they're getting, well paid potentially, and they don't have any incentive to actually go and explore what's happening, or, lift their head out of the sand and see what's happening in the US and realize that Bitcoin is making, massive inroads, as you say, ETFs across the board, even within Europe as well. Like, is there no real, incentive, or are you seeing any evidence of anyone potentially? I know there's a couple of guys. He was on referencing Peter McCormick quite a bit. I can't remember the gentleman's name. He's a politician from the UK. I know he discussed Bitcoin in Parliament back in 2012. Was it?
Steve Baker.
Yes, that's the name. Sorry, I forgot it. He's obviously clued into the system. He's clued into what's happening. It's just talking within, politicians and within spaces. Like, I have no experience within politics. I have no real desire to get into politics, but is that the only way that change can really be driven? Are you seeing that? Is that the only way, or is it, as Bitcoin is a grassroots movement, is the likes of business owners adopting Bitcoin, talking about Bitcoin, making their customers aware of Bitcoin, which is effectively what I'm trying to do in my small business? Is there merit in doing that, or, what would be the main driver of adoption within the UK potentially in that respect?
I think that's almost more powerful than speaking to politicians.
Yeah.
So every single extra person who understands Bitcoin is likely to lead to a butterfly effect, really, of more and more people going on to understand it afterwards. And one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is once you begin learning about it and using it, you very rarely go back. So you have the odd occasion of, I don't know, someone who lost all of their Bitcoin in Mt. Gox back in the day, or had a horrendous experience with FTX. You'll have the odd person who washes their hands of it. Taleb, for example, who wrote the original foreword to the Bitcoin standard, he's an example. But then I don't think he'd ever used any Bitcoin. Yeah. So I think there's an enormous value in small businesses and in talking to your friends. And I mean, God, I bore my children silly talking about it. But, to them, they're growing up in a world where Bitcoin is normal. Yeah. And that is my long-term vision. It's a world where no one talks about Bitcoin because it's just what we're using to pay, even if you don't know you're using the Lightning Network as a payment rail.
Yeah.
We're just transferring value between each other. And, maybe I'm using the Lightning Network, maybe I'm using Swift, doesn't really matter. maybe my current account is in pounds, my savings account is in Bitcoin. It's just a normal part of your financial life as a human individual. To your question as to whether it's useful talking to politicians, I think it's important to consider we've got really two buckets of people with influence here. One are politicians who, as we know, don't understand things fully. And in some respect, I have sympathy for them because they get bombarded with so much information and they have so little time. Part of the art there is refining your message so that it can be put on a single page. A bigger problem, I think, weirdly, is the civil service, because the civil service is full of people who are very, very tightly in that corner that we've discussed already, the quadrant of people who have very high intelligence and very high trust in the system. So, my academic background, I did classics at Cambridge, I was at Queen's College, and a lot of my contemporaries went into the civil service. And in fact, most of my closest friends are now civil servants. I'm in a group of I'm in the group of my closest friends. I'm the only one who actually pays any tax in that group. All the rest of them, basically, I'm paying for all of the rest of the people in that group to enjoy their fat pensions and their comfortable lives and their wonderful offices in St James's and in Westminster and Whitehall. I got into a lot of trouble in that group recently I just innocently asked whether do we need every single one of the 500,000 civil servants that we have in the United Kingdom? Maybe 10% of them are not required. That was an anathema to this group. But those are people who all of them hate Bitcoin passionately or are extraordinarily disinterested in learning anything about it. So my closest friend who works at the Foreign Office, actually it's the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, I think now, FUCDO, which great name,
Cracking.
absolutely cracking. So it's I forget your exact words there, but there was something that reminded me of him when he was speaking. He is. I've sent him, obviously over the years, a bunch of stuff about Bitcoin, and I even pinged him some sats a few years ago. He is very, very keen on the idea of state control of money. He believes that the state should be the party that controls monetary policy and controls money. And I think that consideration is quite an interesting conclusion to draw from the type of thinking that these people will typically have. So not that I want to use this as a pejorative, but he's very much a statist. So he believes that the nation state should control the currency and should control the money. And the idea of a money that can't be controlled by the state genuinely seems to frighten him. Mm-hmm. So I spend a lot of my time trying to think my way into these people's shoes and find ways of messaging them that will appeal to their interests and to what they might like.
Yeah. And I think I would be very libertarian leaning as well, Freddie, in my views, and I think it's inevitable. A lot of Bitcoiners know that it's going to seep its way into every industry. So it's inevitable that it's going to have an impact on politics. The conversation around how this happens, and it's already started off, with cypherpunks years ago, and a couple of tech guys got into it, and it's kind of grown up, and now it has got a lot more formal in ways. But my preference, and not to say that it's going to work out like this, is that everyone gets it at the grassroots level. First of all, I think a lot of people have been taking advantage of the fiat system over a long, long time, and it would be good to see it happen the other way about. A lot of the wealth accumulate amongst the many, and the people who are benefiting from the fiat system are blindly ignoring it because the system that they're in is really benefiting them much more. Mm. So it's an interesting concept, and that's the way I would like it to happen. But I'm also realistic. There has to be groups of people. I think you might have touched point with Bitcoin Network Ireland as well, who's looking at the Irish political system and seeing what impact they can have there. But it's just an interesting conversation how this will form in the future and how it'll come about. Everybody will have their own opinion, but there's so many people knocking on different doors, like small businesses, individuals, politicians, corporate. Samson Mao, I think he's doing a lot at the nation state level. So it's everywhere.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. I completely agree with you. I would prefer to see this as a bottom-up adoption movement rather than a top-down imposition. The key reasons, if I had to sum it up, why we're doing this at all, is because the nation states still have an ability to restrict the freedom of individuals to adopt it. And that's what we're trying to push back against. And two specific examples I can give you, certainly from the UK. One is the restriction of that are imposed by banks on people's ability to move their money on and off exchanges, for example. Debanking is a huge problem. And the amount, even if a bank will allow you to move money to and from an exchange, they are very, very wary around the transfers of large amounts. So the government policies have a direct effect on the ability of individuals to adopt Bitcoin. And in that specific example. And secondly, in the UK, and actually this comes into one of the points we might want to finish on, the FCA has done two things over the past few years. Firstly, it's completely restricted the ability of retail investors to get exposure via ETFs. Personally, I'm not a massive ETF fan, but I acknowledge that there's a market for them. And if that's how people want to invest their money, or if that's how they want to get their Bitcoin exposure, then fair enough. It's lawful. They should be allowed to do that. The FCA has completely restricted that. And secondly, the FCA has designated Bitcoin a restricted mass market investment, which is utterly idiotic and something we take great issue with. And the consequence of that is that exchanges can't advertise properly in the UK. Businesses such as Fold, for example, can't really operate here because obviously Fold's business model involves giving you Bitcoin rewards. And that kind of model can't work. I mentioned earlier the product that I helped to build at Curve. That was a Bitcoin cashback product. That some other shitcoins were also involved, but there was a strong shitcoin lobby at the company, I'm afraid. But it started life as a Bitcoin cashback. We had to kill that product purely because of the FCA, and that I'm still sad about that. We worked for 2 years to create and launch that product, and that was completely killed simply by the FCA's designation. So while I completely agree with you that I want it to be a bottom-up movement, the regulators and the government are still in a position where they can stop that adoption happening as quickly as we would like.
Yeah, and that all makes sense. Yeah, to tackle from that end. Do you think some of it makes you think sometimes that they do understand it because is it protectionism, of their own industry, or do they genuinely think this is a threat for people and they're trying to protect people? Like, are they protecting themselves or protecting the people? Like that's. Yeah.
I think ultimately they're protecting themselves. They are all terrified of making a mistake and there being a gigantic Celsius, FTX, Mt. Gox blow up in their face. So again, practical example. The current CEO of the FCA is a guy called Nikhil Rathi. Without libeling him, I'll give an opinion. This is my opinion, not fact. In my opinion, he has not been a very growth-oriented and business-focused head of the FCA. I've also heard a rumor that he wants the job at the bank, at the head of the Bank of England once Andrew Bailey leaves. So it's extraordinarily unlikely that he's going to do anything innovative at the FCA before he leaves. So my personal view is it's very unlikely we'll see a change in course from the FCA before he's gone, which is a shame, but you can contextualize that within the realpolitik of what we know about Nikhil and how the FCA is likely to behave until he goes.
Yeah. So it's not so much that it's the fear of Bitcoin and then central banks and then bank. It's more there's a fear in case they let something in and it blows up and they get the blame for it blowing up. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. If you Occam razor it, it's that they are worried that they'll, and we can't deny that Bitcoin historically has had violent upside and violent downside. The volatility is part of the price you pay for being early, and they are all terrified. It's the contrast between fear of failure and need to achieve. It's they're all dominated by loss avoidance.
Yeah. You mentioned this a couple of times, FTX blew up, and Celsius, and I think you mentioned Mt. Gox in there. I actually don't know the background of this, although I just know the figure, and it may not be the same at the moment, but the amount of Bitcoin that the UK actually hold is, I think, significant. I think it's one of the largest in the world. Is there any talk in the policy regulatory world, or anything you're aware of what's happening to that? Is it going to is there any talk at all? And what usually happens with an asset like that in the UK? Maybe you're not well versed in that, but I know you've got a law background. Like, do they have to sell it back to the public?
How long do we have? This is quite interesting. Yeah, so again, a few bits and pieces to touch on there. So you're completely right. The UK is the third biggest nation state holder that we know of. So disclosed coins, I think it's the US first, then China, then the UK, which is an extraordinary position to be in. So from a policy and advocacy point of view, we've actually been using this as frankly, an appeal to self-interest. So we first started raising this to Rachel Reeves and to Tulip Siddiq, as was then city minister, in July last year. And since we first mentioned it, the Bitcoin, I think, has tripled in value without them doing anything. So we keep hammering on them on this. So say, look, you haven't even, without you even introducing a Bitcoin positive policy, you guys have tripled your money on.
Bitcoin is one of the most profound innovations of our time, and understanding it is more important than ever. That's why we're hosting the Bitcoin Breakthrough event, a live 3-day experience designed to help you accelerate your understanding of Bitcoin. It's a virtual event. Just bring your phone or laptop. No hype, no pressure, just clear, honest discussions about how Bitcoin works and why it matters. You can join, listen and learn at your own pace. No cameras, no speaking required. Just tune in and absorb. At the end, there's an opportunity to interact with us and ask questions if you'd like. If you've ever been curious about Bitcoin, this is your chance. Join us at our next Bitcoin Breakthrough live event. Go to Emerge21.com and look for the Bitcoin Breakthrough to take your first step.
Well, I mean, effectively, that's an appeal to self-interest. It's tripled in value without them introducing any positive policies whatsoever. And so part of the messaging has been, imagine how much more money you could make if you introduce some sensible policies that would support the industry and recognize it as a legitimate asset. The specific question around how we got it and what's going to happen with it, do you know the story?
I don't. I've seen the figure only recently. I don't know a lot of nation states who hold Bitcoin. It's as a result of confiscation. So I'm assuming it's some kind of confiscation.
Yeah, exactly. So the story starts quite a long time ago. So there was a fraudster originally from the Chinese mainland, and they were involved in a scheme where they defrauded a large number of Chinese investors of yuan, and that's an important point, in about 2014, I think it was. And then they relocated, ended up eventually in the UK. And by this point, they had converted the yuan to Bitcoin, again in 2014. It's important to remember that the victims lost yuan, not Bitcoin. And obviously, since 2014, Bitcoin has absolutely skyrocketed in value. There were 3 parties involved at the time, and there were various arrests and confiscations of assets, including a laptop which contained the keys to the Bitcoin, which we understand the Met Police got hold of, I think, in 2023. And one of the people involved has been convicted, and there is a trial of another one of the perpetrators, which is due to happen this Easter, I think. So worth keeping an eye out on the progress of that. So at the moment, as far as we understand it, and this is supported by Arkham Intelligence review of chain analysis. So they have matched public statements from the Met Police to transfers into what they think is the government's wallet. And as far as we know, that Bitcoin is now sitting there. And until at least the second or potentially the third case is heard, nothing can really happen to that at the moment. So there's basically a forced hodl going on by the by the UK government until that case is determined. So currently it's held under the Proceeds of Crime Act, and ordinarily under the Proceeds of Crime Act, the victims would be compensated, and then anything left over is split 50-50 between the Home Office and law enforcement. At the moment, the 61,000 Bitcoin is roughly double the annual budget of the Met Police, the whole annual budget. So there's an extraordinary amount of value sitting there. And our argument to Rachel Reeves and to Julip Siddiq was that that's such a huge amount that probably merits new primary legislation to come up with a plan to deal with it. So I mentioned earlier that the victims lost yuan, not Bitcoin. And that's interesting because it means that there's a good argument to be made that while the victims should be compensated, they shouldn't be compensated with the Bitcoin. They should be repaid the amount that they lost in 2014 in the currency that they lost, which is yuan. And so, again, from a legal perspective, I would suggest the likely outcome here is that we sell enough of the Bitcoin to make the victims whole, so that they're recompensed for what they suffered, potentially plus interest, and then the rest of the Bitcoin is effectively ours. And the idea of splitting it 50-50 between the Home Office and the Met Police is pretty daft, considering that I think it's now worth it's worth over $6 billion.
Yeah,
crazy.
It is crazy. But yeah, I didn't know that myself, the story behind that.
Yeah, so.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's I guess like looking what you're doing now with Bitcoin Policy UK. I know didn't you send something through today as well? It was you tweeted it to do with tax on, was it using loans or collateral? No, for Bitcoin as collateral, or was it something around that kind of aspect?
Exactly right. So without going too deep into sort of tax technicalities, at the moment, it's impossible to safely to use Bitcoin as collateral for a loan because HMRC currently view that as a disposal of the Bitcoin. So you would have a dry tax charge, a CGT hit, in other words, if I was to attempt to use my Bitcoin as collateral. Now, if you do that with shares or other forms of securities, what's called the repo legislation or repurchase legislation doesn't treat that as a disposal. It's considered what's called a no gain, no loss transaction. So in other words, you can tie up some shares that you own, use them as collateral, get a loan, and you don't have a CGT hit. So all we're arguing in that piece of work is that Bitcoin should be treated in exactly the same way as other shares or securities or other property, basically. Now, there was legislation before Parliament. HMRC had drafted it, and there was good cross-party support for that, but politicians have taken their eye off the ball. So the purpose of today's piece of work was to try and bring that back into the conversation and to attempt to push that over the line to ensure that gets passed. And the exciting thing there is that if that is passed, then that opens the door to a whole new raft of financial products and should tie in nicely with Rachel Reeves's growth agenda. Because, again, I mentioned earlier, I'm fond of living in the UK and I like it here, and we have a great reputation in financial services, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we should be good at. We've got great minds working in our financial centres, in the City of London, in Edinburgh, all across our major financial centres. And at the moment, they are unable to devise and to offer these kind of products because of poor legislation, frankly.
Yeah, it's an important concept. And I guess as well, a lot of people, holding Bitcoin will be, ideally want to use that as collateral at some point, either now or in the future. But there's probably been quite a few people didn't realize that as well, with that respect, regarding capital gains from that context. And that would apply even using services out of like the US or Canada and places like that. Is that correct? If you were using a loan service from the likes of Ledin or some of those companies, and you're based in the UK, that would apply. Is that correct?
Technically, yes. Yeah. So it makes no sense, and frankly, I don't think even the intention of HMRC is to catch that. But if you follow the letter of the law at the moment, then yes, you would be subject to that dry tax charge. And like I said, in the previous Parliament, legislation was reasonably well advanced. We just want to try and re-energize that and push that effort over the line.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's important work, definitely. And I guess what is what's next for Bitcoin Policy UK? What's on the horizon? Is it a matter of just chipping away, keeping on top of people, trying to educate and trying to get these things in front of as many people within government as possible? Or is there a specific agenda that you have a trajectory for Bitcoin Policy UK?
Well, a bit of both, really. You mentioned what sort of contact we've had with people in positions of power. Part of the problem has been the revolving door that we've seen over the last couple of years. So we'd established dialogue with Andrew Griffith when he was city minister, and subsequently with Bir Mafalami when he took over as city minister. Then obviously there was the change of government, so we had to start again from scratch. Decent communication actually with Tulip Siddiq when she was city minister. She'd actually written to us twice in response to two of the different matters that we were engaging with her. And we'd also had decent dialogue with the all-party parliamentary group. I'd been to Parliament 2 or 3 times to speak at the APPG. Unfortunately, that APPG was obviously disbanded at the time of the election and has not yet been reconstituted. So again, that's all of the efforts there have been a little bit hamstrung. We are making progress, and every month we're making more and more contacts. We are, I can't go into too many details yet because these are non-public, but we have at least 2 or 3 events planned for the first half of this year, certainly, where we're aiming to have shadow ministers and also up-and-coming people from both majority and minority parties who might have an interest in this area. And it's obviously not just Bitcoin per se. It's also the concepts of hard money, people who are worried about sovereign debt, people who are worried about the extent of our interest burden. Why, for example, are we paying more on interest repayments than we spend on education or defense? These are important questions, and they all come back to the monetary issues that we understand, which are not not solely about Bitcoin. That they're important questions that you need to understand when you're trying to run a monetary economy. Mm-hmm. And we touched on Rachel Reeves' growth agenda a couple of times. I think that's actually quite helpful. And recently she has been critical of the FCA in terms of their restriction of the development of new businesses. And I think the repo legislation we mentioned a couple of minutes ago is a great example of that. If that can be pushed through, that's going to lead that will unlock a lot of innovation, a lot of opportunity for banks and for other players within the financial industry to do some interesting stuff and frankly to pull business back into the City of London.
Yeah, that sounds good. No, it's so much work. As you say, it's like a revolving door sometimes, I'm sure. I feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall.
Yeah.
But it's so important. Like both myself and Chris were so kind of admiration of what you guys are doing about Bitcoin or Bitcoin Policy UK. And it's such a, it's great to sit and watch and see progress, from our point of view as well. I suppose, like from my point of view, just one last question. I want to be respectful of your time. Obviously, it's getting a little bit late here. But is there any, what kind of advice would you give to the likes of ourselves or anybody else, trying to grow adoption within like the grassroots level? What sort of advice would you give to the likes of ourselves, for instance, and what we're doing? Is it a matter of just putting out as much content, educating people as much, or is it worthwhile trying to approach and make contact with our politicians locally within council, or just as you say, go from that grassroots level, talk to your friends and family, and just try to get the Bitcoin message out to as many people as possible?
I think there's a nice middle ground to be made, actually, and just picking up on something you said there, go to your local politicians. I think that's more powerful than a lot of people may understand. And again, just to give you a specific example, my kids go to the local school. They have a small pool, and in the summer, it's always at risk of being shut down. And I approached the local council last year to have a sort of scoping call with them to see if they'd be interested in if we could put some miners next to the pool and heat it using the miners. That would reduce their heating costs. If we were able to power them using solar panels and battery storage, and it's effectively mining as a cost mitigator for a specific problem they have, which is that the pool is expensive to run. And if we could devise a solution that would reduce that cost, would they be interested? And I was actually quite surprised at how open-minded they were. And I think things like that are much more important than we perhaps give them credit for. and I can think of any number of others. For example, heating costs. Bitcoin mining as a mitigator of heating costs is hugely underappreciated. You're probably as sick as I am of the winter and the temperatures at the moment. But if you, for example, heat mitigation costs for food banks or for warm banks, these are important considerations. I think don't necessarily come across people's radar, but those are exactly the kind of ideas that people locally in a local council or a town council, and then a local MP might become excited by. And the reason is simple: it's because they solve a real problem on the ground that people may suffer from, and that's ultimately what Bitcoin is for. It's people. I was at a conference last year when someone said something really lovely to the room. And it was that you're all here because you're fixers. You've identified problems and you want to fix them. I think that's a lovely message to have. But that, like you say, it works really well on a grassroots level. And ultimately, decisions that are made in regulators in London and in Parliament are the product of those grassroots impetus ultimately.
Yeah. No, that's good. Good advice as well around that. But yeah, Chris, do you have anything else you want to ask Freddie or add, or?
No, maybe more of a comment than a question. But like I was always of the opinion that there wasn't a lot happening in UK and Ireland in this space. Other countries are going to get way ahead. Outpace. So that was one of the reasons for starting Emerge21. And even in these few months that we've started, the amount of people that we've actually linked in with is promising. I was kind of of the opinion that maybe I might have to move country at some stage. I think Bitcoin's going to be inevitable in every country at a certain point. But I thought it was probably mainly driven in the UK by demographics. So as you say, there's going to be politicians now that aren't maybe internet native. There's a whole generation coming up. Like you're teaching your kids, like we're teaching our kids this stuff. And there's a generation coming up behind that just get this automatically. Maybe not the full monetary side and the history side, but they'll be more widely accepted. So I was my horizon was, the UK is going to get this in 10, 20 years time. But with what we're doing, you're doing, and all the people we've linked in with over the last few months, I'm definitely more hopeful in the UK. I think it's a lot of work to be done, but I think over the last year or two, I've seen a lot more progress here. And it's good.
I completely agree
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lovely quote from Douglas Adams about technologies. So, and I'm going to get this wrong, but it's something like, anything invented before you're 10 years old is completely normal. Anything invented after you're 10, before you're 20, is immensely exciting, and you can probably get a job in it. And then anything invented after you're 40 is wrong and against the natural order of things. So it's
probably accurate. It feels that way for many.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. No, that's great. Well, again, I say thank you very much, Freddie. I said we won't keep you much longer this evening. I suppose just where's the best place for anybody to follow you or link in with you? Would it be on the likes of X or LinkedIn or some of those platforms, I guess, or
probably X or Twitter. So I'm most active there. That's where we tend to publish most of our work first. I'm at Freddie New with an IE. I do also cross-publish stuff on LinkedIn. I hate going on LinkedIn, but that is where a lot of the people I need to reach still are.
Yeah, you're forced to.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Well, obviously, we'll leave all the links below the episode. But yeah, thanks anyway, Freddie, for coming on. Really, really great to hear your story, what you're doing within Bitcoin policy, and just your journey and what the journey you've been on. So appreciate everything you're doing. And is there anything, just last thing, anything else you want to leave us with? For our listeners, any last words of wisdom? Just to put you on the spot.
I think I'd sort of return to something that we've talked about before, which is how important grassroots connections are, and those include something as fundamental as your family. Obviously my wife is absolutely sick to death of hearing me talk about Bitcoin, but to my children it's normal, and eventually I think the goal of all of us is to. I'm going to steal this from Bridge to Bitcoin. It's to normalize, not evangelize. Bitcoin is a normal thing, and it's going to become a normal thing. It's just a bit too new for everyone to understand that. And the more normal we can make it, the quicker its adoption will come.
Perfect. Yeah, sounds good. We have to normalize Bitcoin. But that's perfect. Thank you, Freddie. We'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you.
We'll hope to get you back on at some point in the future, and we'll be able to hear about all the progress that we're all making in the world of Bitcoin and going forward. Thanks for now. Cheers.
Chris, Alan, thank you so much. Pleasure to be
Really
here.
enjoyed that. Thanks, Freddie.
That was really fun. Thank you, guys.